Madam Shehnaz Ghazi, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Bangladesh, present here, and Mr. Rangut Wirabut, Deputy Director General of the Department of International Organizations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Thailand, and Madam Nenet Motus, Coordinator, Regional UN Network on Migration for Asia and the Pacific, and Regional Director of IOM, Regional Office for the Asia and Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to invite Madam Shehnaz Ghazi, CDA of the Embassy of Bangladesh, to deliver her opening remarks. Madam Shehnaz Ghazi, please.
Her Excellency, Ms. Armita Sazia Ali Jabana, Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of UNESCAP, Mr. Rangwood Wirabut, Deputy Director General, Department of International Organization, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Thailand, Madam Nenet Motus, Regional Director, IOM Asia and the Pacific, Excellencies, distinguished panel members who are joining us in person and online, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. At the outset, I would like to convey my warm regards on this International Migrants Day. We are delighted that this year the Embassy of Bangladesh has partnered with UNESCAP and the UN Network on Migration in celebrating the International Migrants Day. I would like to thank UNESCAP and the UN Network on Migration for choosing this day for launching the Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, migration has always been an integral part of human existence. Migrants generate economic, social, and cultural benefits for societies everywhere. Migrants make so much of sacrifice as they, at times, leave their families and homeland for contributing their ideas, labor, and resources to the development of the host countries. Today, on International Migrants Day, we recognize their immense contributions and celebrate the vitality of the world's over 272 million migrants. Last year in 2019, international migrants comprised 3.5% of the global population. Among them, over 10 million Bangladeshis are living and working in different countries all over the world, who are significantly contributing to the development of not only their host countries, but also for Bangladesh. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes the contribution of migration to sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda has explicit targets to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-mannered migration policies, to reduce the cost of remittances, and protect rights and promote safe and secure working environment for all workers, including migrant workers and in particular women migrants. 11 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals contain targets and indicators relevant to migration and mobility. SDG targets emphasizes on reducing transaction cost of migration remittances to less than 3% by 2030. The government of Bangladesh is providing 2% cash incentives on migrants' remittances that has a positive impact on remittance flow. The government of Bangladesh has included action plans in their 7th five-year plan to achieve the migration-related SDG. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of Bangladesh, under the leadership of Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, is striving to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration. Migration has been included in the national policy of Bangladesh. Bangladesh has played a leadership role in Global Compact for Migration and Global Forum on Migration and Development. Here, I am pleased to mention that the proposal made by our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina for a global compact on migration at the United Nations General Assembly in 2016 has been adopted in Marrakesh. Bangladesh has co-led a joint statement on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants in June 2020, which was eventually supported by 103 member states. The statement calls upon the member states to incorporate the health needs of migrants in national and local healthcare policies and plans. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to inform that Bangladesh is one of the first countries to have agreed to take up the lead role in GCM implementation, follow-up and review process. Bangladesh is one of the 15 countries primarily identified as champion countries for the GCM implementation. Our government is working closely with the UN Network on Migration to develop a roadmap for implementation of the GCM. Currently, the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic has made the migrants more vulnerable. Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, at the 31st special session of the United Nations General Assembly this December, urged for ensuring universal and equitable access to quality COVID-19 vaccine for all so that no one is left behind. Global community must ensure availability of affordable vaccines, medicines, and equipments for migrants in vulnerable situations, integrating the health of migrants and their families in the global discourse of universal health coverage. Ladies and gentlemen, Bangladesh government is striving for the protection of the rights of the migrants. Bangladesh has included the migrants and the returning migrants in the stimulus package for COVID response and recovery. In short term, our government has allocated emergency support fund for migrants. In long term, soft loan packages for rehabilitation of the returning migrants has been declared. A special committee has been working to fast-track the safe and dignified return of the stranded migrants during COVID pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is aware that Bangladesh is temporarily hosting over 1.1 million forcibly displaced Rohingyas from Myanmar purely out of humanitarian gesture. Bangladesh continues to seek a peaceful solution to this crisis and stresses upon the need of ensuring the return of these people to Myanmar in a safe and dignified manner. The government of Bangladesh is doing its best for the safety and security of these displaced Myanmar nationals. Uh, at this stage, it is only practical that the international community uh, engage in meaningful discussion with Myanmar to ensure these people's repatriation, which is the only durable solution to this crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, the father of the nation of Bangladesh, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, struggled throughout his life for people's rights, democracy, and pluralism. Following the principles set by our father of the nation, Bangladesh has become a role model in many fields, including the preservation of the rights of the migrants. 2020 is the birth centenary of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Therefore, this year, the government has resolved to build awareness for enabling the migrants to achieve necessary skills before going abroad for work. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome the launch of the Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020 at today's event and would like to congratulate UNESCAP and the members of the UN Network on Migration for Asia and the Pacific for their hard work. I'm sure that this report will help the member states to ensure a collaborative and comprehensive response to the call for action of the Global Compact for Migration. We are also aware that the Asia Pacific Regional Review of the Global Compact for Migration is also coming up next year March. I extend my best wishes for the preparation of a successful meeting. Here, I would like to thank all participants and especially the panelists of today's panel discussions and look forward to a very meaningful discussion and outcome. I also look forward to celebrate the International Migrants Day in similar manner in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Shehnaz, for highlighting Bangladesh government's role for migrant workers affected in COVID situation. and of course highlighting your country's role in the field of migration. Thank you very much, madam. Now, may I please to invite Mr. Rangut Wirabut, Deputy Director General of the Department of International Organizations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Thailand, to deliver his statement. Sir, Mr. Rangut Wirabut, the floor is yours.
Excellency, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. At the outset, I would like to express my appreciation to the co-chair of this important event, the Embassy of Bangladesh and the UN Network on Migration for the Asia and the Pacific, for extending the invitation for Thailand to offer remarks in this morning. It's an honor for Ministry of Foreign Affairs to be invited and pleasure to join in the commemorating International Migrant Day 2020. The majority of migrants in Thailand are migrant workers from our neighboring countries. They currently constitute about 10% of the total workforce, representing a significant part of the backbone of Thai economy. Not only does Thailand recognize this fact, but we appreciate and support it. We have worked hard to conclude bilateral labor MOU with all of our neighboring countries in order to ensure a fair recruitment process and treatment for migrant labor in the country. This certainly has not been straightforward, and there are still gaps in our work on managing regular and irregular migration. But we take encouragement from the fact that much of our effort has borne fruit. This year, we are faced with the unprecedented challenge of COVID-19. It has forced all of us to adapt and to adjust essentially all aspects of our life. But we have looked at this silver lining. COVID-19 has also taught us about resilience, and it revealed to us where we need to do more. In the process, we are reminded that the people who have always been resilient and who have always had to preserve in the face of challenge and adversity are migrants. I believe we all need to learn a lesson or two from migrants to shape our mindset with a positive attitude and embrace the brave spirit inherent in migrants in dealing with change and adaptation. Excellency, in 2018, international community adopted the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, or the GCM. Thailand is committed to the goal of this document and determined to continue to promote the well-being and protect the basic human rights of all migrants. We believe in international cooperation and our shared responsibility to manage this complex issue of migration and look forward to identify the gaps and expanding our best practice in upcoming regional review. We also commend all of those involved in the preparation of the Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020 and look forward to studying it in detail in order to prepare for the upcoming regional review. To conclude, please allow me the opportunity to applaud migrant communities around the world for their indispensable contribution. Let us look forward to a brighter future where a truly inclusive society become a reality. Thank you.
Thank you for your thought-provoking statement, Mr. Rangut Wirabut. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, now it is my great honor to invite Her Excellency Armida Salsia Alizabana, Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to deliver her opening remarks. Madam Executive Secretary, please.
Ms. Shahnaz Ghazi, Chargé d'Affaires, Embassy of the People's Republic of Bangladesh, Mr. Rongwood Firabut, Deputy Director General of the Department of International Organization, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Thailand, Ms. Nanette Motus, Coordinator, Regional United Nations Network on Migration for Asia and the Pacific, and Regional Director, IOM, Asia and the Pacific. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the observance of the International Migrants Day. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Embassy of the People's Republic of Bangladesh in Thailand and the International Organization for Migration, Asia and Pacific, for their support in organizing today's event. As the United Nations commemorates the 75th anniversary, the reimagining human mobility must continue to strengthen our efforts to achieve, transform, and resilient societies in Asia and the Pacific. Since the onset of COVID-19, the evidence shows that migrants have been among the most disproportionately affected as they face challenges to their lives and livelihoods. However, at the same time, migrants are essential workers supporting countries through the pandemic and beyond, and are therefore part of the solution to COVID-19 and countries' long-term sustainable recovery. In responding to this crisis and for building back better, the need to focus on safe, orderly, and regular migration has never been more urgent. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, international migration is a defining and expanding global and regional reality. Its levels, complexity, and impacts have increased over time. Currently, there are about 65 million international migrants in Asia and the Pacific, and about 107 million people from the region are living outside their countries of birth. These migrants contribute to countries of origin and destination every day. They send remittances worth almost a third of $1 trillion in 2019, contribute to economic growth in countries of destination, help reduce poverty in countries of origin, and develop and transfer skills. It has long been clear that to achieve SDGs in the Asia Pacific region, migrants need to be included, their human rights respected. In view of this, we are launching today the Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020, assessing implementation of the Global Compact for Migration. I thank all of my colleagues in ESCAP and in all UN agencies of the regional network for their support and collaboration in preparing this report and in co-organizing the regional review. Please allow me to highlight key findings of the report. First, governments and relevant stakeholders must scale up collaborative action to ensure a whole of government and whole of society approach that will mitigate socioeconomic impacts on migrants and their families. Second, governments must undertake extra efforts to achieve SDGs, which will in turn support the implementation of the Global Compact for Migration. Third, governments must collaborate more closely through policy coordination, norm setting, and cooperation across all 23 objectives of the Global Compact of Migration. And fourth, migration policies must respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all migrants and their families, reduce situations of vulnerability they face, and integrate them into sustainable development as, as both agents of change and beneficiaries. Migration policy should always be child sensitive and gender responsive. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm confident that with the establishment of the regional United Nations Network on Migration for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP, along with the UN system, will take forward the recommendations of the report. This will also provide another opportunity to work towards the first Asia-Pacific regional review of the Global Compact from 10 to 12 March next year, 2021, within the ESCAP platform to ensure concrete action and solution-oriented follow-up. I urge all member states and stakeholders to participate in this upcoming review process to ensure that all people are able to move safely to be included in societies and contribute to and benefit from sustainable development in Asia and Pacific and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency Alizabana, for your remarks and leading your organization for the cause of the migrants. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to regret that the video we are supposed to display next, we cannot do that. For that, we move to our next proceeding. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, as Her Excellency Alizabana highlighted today, ISCAP and the Regional UN Network on Migration are launching the Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020 today. I would like to invite Excellency Executive Secretary, UN ISCAP, and Madam Nenet Motus, Coordinator of the Asia Pacific Regional UN Network on Migration, to formally launch this report. Excellency Executive Secretary and Madam Nenet Motus, may I invite you to the stage? Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this is the launching of the report. A big hand, please. It's a big day.
Thank you, Madam Executive Secretary and Ms. Mortis. Following the launch, may we welcome Ms. Nanette Mortis one more time, Coordinator of the Asia-Pacific UN Network on Migration and Regional Director, IOM, Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, and Mr. Francisco J. Santos Harapadron, Regional Advisor, Recovery, Livelihoods and Human Mobility, UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub. Mr. Padron and Ms. Mortos will moderate the two panel discussions. The first panel discussion focuses on the Asia-Pacific Migration Report 2020. This will feature Ms. Sabine Henning, Chief Sustainable Demographic Transition Section of ESCAP, Mr. Niliam Barua, Senior Regional Labour Migration Specialist, ILO, Ms. Pia Oberoi, Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights, OHCHR, and Ms. Nayaradzo Chari Imbayago, Senior Regional Policy and Liaison Officer, IOM. Mr. Padron and Ms. Mortos, please.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel 2 and panel 3 sessions. And for this first panel, I would like, which is the a presentation, a panel discussion on implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, so which is highlighted by our Asia Pacific Migration Report. And then I'd like to then turn the floor to you, Francesco. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nanette, Mrs. Motus, and thank you everybody for being here today. It's a day of reflection and celebration. It's a joint effort that we have all done here, working, contributing to this Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020. It is a day of reflection on the achievements on the best practices with regards to the implementation of the Global Compact. But it's also a day of reflection to recognize the contributions that migrants have been and are given to the sustainable development of the countries of origin and the countries of destination, and also to help unlock the potential for them to continue and strengthen their contribution in the future. I want to go with no further ado to invite my colleagues, my dear colleagues from across the UN, in telling us a little bit on what are the new, what does this new report, the report brings in new, the main findings, the trends, and how also are we integrating, are we looking at the COVID exacerbated impact on these vulnerable populations and the regional migration networks supporting that. So I will ask first my dear colleague Sabine, what is that the report tell us about the main trends in migration in the Asia-Pacific in 2019? Over to you, Sabine, thanks.
Thank you very much, Francisco. And before I begin, I would like to thank the members of the regional network, in particular the main authors who are joining us for the discussion today, ILO, OHCHR and IOM, and all the other members of the network who have contributed so much to this report. I would also like to thank the ESCAP Social Development Division and the team that has been working so hard on this report, and its director, Mr. Srinivas Tata, for his guidance. The report shows, as indicated in some of these PowerPoints we're showing, that international migration flows from, to, and between Asian and Pacific countries have increased over the past 30 years. The number of migrants in the region has grown from 52 million in 1990 to 65 million in 2019, while the number of emigrants, people leaving from countries in the region, increased from 65 million to 107 million, and this is based on migrant stock data. Almost 61 million migrants from the region have moved outside the region in 2019, and this is almost a doubling compared to the value in 1990 when the number stood at about 27 million. Importantly, most migration in the region is intra-regional or south-south. In 2019, almost 46 million migrants from Asia-Pacific countries moved to other countries in the region, while 70% of the foreign-born stock in Asia and the Pacific came from within the region. The percentage of male and female migrants was roughly balanced. However, there's quite a variation depending on the regions, the sub-regions, and of course the countries. Migrants are concentrated in the prime working ages, indicating that most migration is undertaken by persons seeking to work. There were about 7 million child migrants in Asia-Pacific. Although most migrants have adequate documentation, a large number are migrating, living and working in irregular situations that put them at risk of abuse and exploitation. Migration in the region is driven by many factors. Migrants seek new economic opportunities, escape from armed conflict, poverty, food insecurity, persecution, and threats to their human rights. Climate change and natural disasters also drive people to leave their countries of origin. Often, multiple factors are involved. Return and circular migration are likewise very common. Irregular migration takes place across the region, and smuggling and trafficking in person occurs at high levels as well. An important point we need to remember, and we already heard a bit about this earlier today, is that the remittances, which are probably the most visible contribution made by migrants to their countries of origin, almost doubled between 2009 and 2019, which the following slide will show. It's now standing at 330 billion. India, China, followed by the Philippines and Pakistan and Bangladesh are the largest remittance recipients. Please show the slide. Remittances are not only important in absolute values, they also represent a significant part of GDP in many countries. Given the importance of remittances, it is so much more important to reduce the cost of remitting and allowing migrants to more fully contribute to development in their countries of origin. It should be noted that this is a broad brush description of what is happening on the ground, and there's considerable variation by sub-region and country. It is also important to recognize that the movement I have described has been facilitated by rapid advances in communication in recent years, transportation, and by the growth of both established and emerging human networks. In conclusion, countries have fallen behind, and we already heard this in the opening statements, regarding the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda. Poverty, environmental degradation, food insecurity, and political conflict have all increased pressure on people to move. And this will continue in the future. Thank you very much, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And I failed to introduce her, although she needs no much introduction. She's the Chief Sustainable Demographic Transition section at ESCAP. Thanks for giving us a little bit of a glimpse of the main trends and the complexities and challenges and the evidence in data about the contributions of migrants to development and the SDGs. Thanks a lot, Sabine. I want to also now ask my dear colleague Nilim Barua, Senior Regional Advisor of Labor Migration Specialist at ILO, please. And if you can tell us about what does the report say about the importance of labor migration in the region, and what are the main challenges in making it safe, orderly, and regular? Over to you, Nilim. Thanks.
Thank you, Francesco. Good morning, everybody, on this occasion to mark International Migrants Day. So, labor migration and work is central to migration flows in the region. The ILO estimated that 70% of all migrants of working age are migrant workers. So, although the Global Compact on Migration and the report we launched rightly takes a comprehensive view of migration, we have to remember that most migrants are actually crossing borders in search of decent work. And what is important to them, probably most important to them, are their working and employment conditions. Now, you would have seen the media reports on COVID-19 vis-a-vis migrants. Most of them relate to migrant workers. 90% of the infections in Singapore were migrant workers. So that gives you a picture about the importance of labor migration and migration for employment in Asia Pacific. And I think all of you are already aware of that. In terms of the challenges are not new, but some of them have been magnified by the pandemic. What are some of the main challenges highlighted in the report? First is the issue of fair recruitment and high migration costs. Second is decent work deficits. Third is obstacles to labor mobility, where there are requirements, labor shortages, skill shortages, and a demand for labor. And fourth is in the area of skills development and recognition. Now, it's not as if things have stayed the same and there has been no progress. Of course, there has been progress in all these areas, which is reflected in the report as well. Now, with regards to fair recruitment and migration costs, which we are all aware of, and in some migration corridors, the migration cost is several months' wages of the worker in destination countries. And it is very important to reduce that. Now, some positive developments can be noted, and the prohibition of recruitment fees have been introduced. The prohibition of recruitment fees charged to workers has been introduced by some countries in the region, including Thailand and Indonesia, and most recently, just in November this year, in the revised law in Vietnam, some costs, the brokerage commission is now prohibited to be charged to migrant workers. There are also initiatives in the private sector to to see that fees are not charged to to migrant workers, their trade union and CSO initiatives. There is guidance provided by the ILO in the fair recruitment principles, and there is the IRIS initiative of the IOM. Yet recruitment costs generally remain high. The regulation of private employment agencies is a continuing challenge and demands attention. The second area is decent work deficits, and here I would like to highlight low or unpaid wages. We have seen in the pandemic, many migrant workers have not been paid the wages and end-of-term benefits owed to them, and some of this is because of the employers having difficulties and businesses collapsing. There's also the issue of employer-provided housing. We have seen a big failure in this area. It's an area which was not given enough attention in the past, but now has been highlighted, and countries of destination have already responded to this. Women migrants continue to face particular risks, particularly in domestic work. I was shocked to hear that during the pandemic in some countries, women migrants who were working as domestic workers lost their jobs, and as a result lost also their shelter and were on the streets. Domestic work is not covered in the labor law of countries, so they're not given the usual protections. And where there has been improvement in laws, there are still gaps in the enforcement and slow process of development of sub-regulations. There are some important positive developments, including the adoption of the 2017 ASEAN Consensus on the protection and promotion of the rights of migrant workers. And there is a common framework in the ASEAN on protection of women and men migrant workers. With regards to obstacles to labor mobility, we should recognize that throughout the region, there are pathways for regular migration. There are pathways. Labor migration is taking place through MOUs, through avenues for skilled workers. But yet, in some migration corridors, these pathways are often costly and cumbersome, particularly for workers in elementary occupations, so-called low-skill occupations. And therefore, in some corridors, there are more people moving through informal channels across the border than through the regular channels. Finally, in the area of skills development and recognition, migrant workers face obstacles in getting their qualifications and skills recognized in countries of destination and on return to the origin country after acquiring skills abroad. So there's a need to have skills recognition not only in the highly qualified areas, but also in middle skilled areas where a lot of migrants move for work. It is important to recognize skills not just in the destination country, but also in return, so that through recognition of their prior learning, their skills and qualifications of migrants returning are better recognized in countries of origin. Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Nilim. It has been a really rich discussion about the decent work aspects of the labor migration, also the skills, the discussions about the skills, the transferability, the portability towards from country of destination to countries of eventual return. And you presented a little bit on the glimpse of the impact of COVID-19. That will be also, our colleague Niari will be deepening a little bit more on that. With no further ado, I would like to give the mic to our Pia Oberoi, also Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights on OHCHR. Please, over to you. And my question to her, to you, Pia, where does the region stand in regards to protection, respecting and fulfilling the rights of migrants in the region, in particular with regard to border governance and border management measures. From a human rights perspective, what are also the main challenges that? Over to you, Pia. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as well from me, greetings on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on this important day, and thank you for the question. So effective border governance is central to achieving safe, orderly, and regular migration. What migrants expect to experience at the border informs their decisions throughout the migration cycle, how they leave and the routes they take, how they live and work in transit and destination, and their options for how, when, and whether they will return. We conclude in the report that laws and policies defining border governance in the Asia-Pacific region can facilitate migration that is safe and dignified for migrants, but that these laws and policies can also exacerbate migrants' risk of abuse and violations at borders. We went through certain particular human rights challenges in relation to the specific objectives of the Global Compact for Migration that are addressed in the chapter on border governance and border management. In Objective 4, for instance, migrants in the region often face a range of barriers to registering the birth of their children, which compromises children's human rights, including their access to education and healthcare. Statelessness is also an enduring challenge in the region. In Objective 8, we noted that search and rescue is a vital element of border management and of ensuring safe migration along transit routes. Countless migrants have died and gone missing in mixed movements along land and sea routes in the region. Turning to Objective 9, smuggling of migrants is often a function of underdevelopment and misaligned border governance. Most states in the region have criminalized migrant smuggling, although some states have unduly expanded the concept of migrant smuggling to also criminalize irregular migration, which we note is neither a crime nor a human rights violation. In Objective 10, human trafficking in the context of migration is a risk for migrants regardless of their status. Migrants who have used regular migration pathways to access work opportunities, such as temporary or seasonal work, may be at risk of exploitation that may indeed constitute trafficking in persons. Turning to Objective 11, in this region, as in others, the border is increasingly digital, which gives rise to human rights concerns, including on data protection and migrants' rights to privacy. Greater capacity building is needed, particularly on gender-responsive, disability-inclusive, and child-sensitive law enforcement, cooperation, and responses at international borders. On Objective 13 relating to detention, across the region, immigration detention is a frequent response to irregular migration. Some migrants may indeed remain in detention indefinitely, solely on the basis of their irregular entry or status until a solution can be found. The UN Network on Migration has called on states to institute a moratorium on immigration detention during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to prioritize release, including through a range of human rights-based, non-custodial alternatives to immigration detention. And finally, on Objective 21 relating to returns. As we've heard, most migration in the region is recorded as temporary labor migration, which means that migrants are expected to return to their origin countries following the ends of their contracts. Many migrants manage to return on their own, but assisted voluntary return as well as forced or coerced returns are also prevalent. Support for reintegration of returned migrants can be minimal throughout the region, jeopardizing the sustainability of these returns and possibly fueling further migrations, sometimes in precarious circumstances. The UN Migration Network has called for the suspension of forced returns during the pandemic in order to protect the health of migrants and communities and uphold the human rights of migrants. So these were just some of the challenges that we have found through the report focusing on border governance and border management. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Pia, for reminding us that and framing the whole discussion on the human rights lens. It's extremely important, and I love your comment on especially irregular migration is not a crime. It's a symptom, but it's not a crime, definitely not. Thanks. I'd like to give the mic to my colleague also, Nyari Chari Imbagoyo. Apologies for that, Nyari. Senior Regional Policy and Liaison Officer at IOM, please. And I would like to know from you, now that we leave the times that we are facing, What has been the impact of COVID-19 on migrants and their families in the region? And what are the main messages that the UN network on migration in this regard? Over to you, Nyari.
Thank you, Francisco, and a valiant effort at pronouncing my very long name, but you can call me Nyari. It's undisputed that COVID-19 has had a profound impact on all our lives. I think we only need to look at how we are seated here today and compare it to how we were seated or how you were seated last year to note the fundamental changes in terms of how we are engaging with each other on an individual level. And migrants and their families in this region are not excluded from the impacts of this. The report we have launched here today has set out a plethora of ways that migrants are impacted on par with nationals, but importantly has also tried to hone in on the great many areas in which migrants and their families are disproportionately impacted. And I recall that the ES made that point earlier on in her remarks. So these impacts have ranged from a heightened risk of contracting the disease due to barriers to lack of access to basic health services, often unsanitary, overcrowded living conditions. We saw the example in several countries where migrants that were living in dorms or in places with poor ventilation or limited space were at more pronounced risk than those that were not. And we've seen also obstacles to undertaking health-seeking behaviors linked potentially to their status in the countries in which they live and work. We've seen increased exposure to infected people, given the role that many migrants have in the context of essential workers, either in healthcare or in food supply chains or other areas of critical importance. We've also documented increase in abuse and violence and a rise in xenophobic tendencies and exclusion from COVID-19 response measures that have threatened the health and well-being of migrants and their families in destination communities. In terms of messaging, the network aligns itself with the UN Secretary General's 4 basic tenets for the post-COVID-19 response. And I'll name them as follows. The first is that exclusion is costly in the long run, and the pivot towards inclusion actually pays off for everyone concerned. This is connected to another tenet that the SG has made that we align ourselves with, that an effective COVID response involves the protection of the human rights of people on the move, and that this is not a mutually exclusive objective to pursue. No one is truly safe until everyone is safe, a third one. And that people on the move are actually part of the solution. And we've seen migrants showing up in different areas of work in support of the COVID response and as part of the solution. And highlighting here that I think anecdotally I've read that, a migrant is actually behind the first COVID vaccine that's beginning to be rolled out, that a migrant, I think a Turkish national, was involved in developing the first vaccine. And I think these are all just things that we can draw on in ensuring that we take advantage of the tremendous capacity and potential that migrants have as agents in and of themselves. We call on member states and stakeholders to weave these tenets into measures geared at preventing, addressing, and rolling back the negative effects of the pandemic. Now, with the arrival of vaccines and efforts to roll vaccines out, we need to ensure that migrants and their families are not left out of these efforts, both from the point of inception, but also through to implementation. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nyari, and I appreciate the challenge to be brief in this very broad and very complex kind of discussions. But thanks a lot for framing it also on the COVID-19 and exclusion, and looking at the whole of society approach on in the current times. Now I'm going to ask, without too much further ado, to our colleague Pia, on from a human rights perspective, what does the region has to do to make migration safe, orderly, and regular? And linked to Niari's point, has COVID-19 changed anything in this regard? Over to you, Pia.
Thank you again, Francisco, and thank you for giving me the floor again. So in relation to your question first, the good news, that we are already seeing examples of good practice in a lot of the issues that have been raised already by the colleagues this morning. We have, for instance, the Regional Action Framework on Civil Registration and Vital Statistics in Asia and the Pacific that was agreed in 2014 and is part of a consensus in the region on the goal of universal birth registration. We see that numerous states in the region have adopted positive measures or even legislation to prohibit or limit the detention of children for immigration-related reasons. We've seen, you talked about the whole of society approach, we've seen efforts of local communities, for instance, local fishing communities in Aceh to bring people in distress at sea to safety on land with regards to coordination on search and rescue. And we're seeing movement on addressing exploitation and trafficking in specific sectors, such as the fishing industry in Thailand. So we do have things that we can build on. Now the challenge that we have before us. The Global Compact for Migration is intended to help states facilitate migration. That's its original purpose. And for this to be effective, it is very clear that governance of borders and governance of migration more broadly cannot be focused only on deterrence, but they must facilitate rights-based entry and stay to enable migrants, to enable host communities to live in dignity and prosper. This objective, overall aim of the Global Compact has come into sharp focus as a result, as we've heard, of the COVID-19 pandemic. Borders that operate only as closed walls lead to vulnerability, abuse, and exploitation. Migration policy that is focused only on punitive deterrence creates underground economies of criminalized people who fear the authorities and, for instance, will not come forward to seek healthcare or to report crime. The reasons why migrants have been disproportionately vulnerable during the COVID pandemic are embedded in many ways into the structure of migration governance in the region. So how can we recover better? I have four thoughts to present this morning.
Very brief, please.
Very briefly. We can put in place regional mechanisms that ensure robust search and rescue and predictable disembarkation at sea. We can expand and enhance the use of alternatives to immigration detention to include but also go beyond children to encompass other groups in vulnerability. We can, in the context of a broad lack of sufficient, accessible, safe and legal pathways for migration, in the region, we should look to implement innovative pathways that provide protection and security to migrants on child protection, for instance, or on health and other human rights grounds, or for those compelled to move because of climate change. The temporary labor migration programs that characterize much of the formal paths of movement of migrants in and from the region frequently, as has been noted, lack a human rights basis, including in denying migrants access to the right to adequate housing and healthcare, presenting barriers to the right to family and to access justice. How do we readjust these programs? All of these measures and more would constitute the reimagination of mobility called for by the UN Secretary General and help ensure that we remove the structural barriers to safe and dignified migration in order to recover better. Thank you, Francisco.
Many thanks, Pia, for your brevity and your clarifying these words. And now I want to ask our colleague Nilim from ILO, are there any lessons that the region could build upon to provide greater access for safe, regular, and accessible migration pathways, keeping in mind the complex and interlinked migration drivers in the region? And of course, has COVID-19 sharpened our focus on the key priority areas for action? Please be brief, Nilim. Thanks.
Thank you, Francisco. I think first is the ratification of relevant UN and ILO conventions. And let me give some examples of the impact here. Convention 19 on equal treatment in occupational accident compensation, which Malaysia has ratified, and in the recent years has made changes in their laws to see that migrant workers and nationals are treated equally. Convention 131, minimum wage fixing, which is ratified by Australia, Japan, Malaysia, Korea, and where in these countries migrant workers receive the minimum wage, although unfortunately domestic workers are not covered in some countries. Convention 29 on forced labor, which amongst other countries, Qatar and the UAE have ratified and have made changes in their legislation with regards to the treatment of migrant workers, especially if you would have noticed with respect to Qatar in the upcoming FIFA World Cup. Thailand has also ratified Convention 29 protocol. Convention 189, decent work for domestic workers, which is ratified by 31 countries in the world, including destination countries, but unfortunately in Asia only by the Philippines, and this requires attention. Convention 188, work in fishing, which is ratified by Thailand and has seen some, after that, important changes in the legislation. Convention 189 on domestic work, although this is not ratified in the region, let me tell you that it was only after this convention was adopted that countries in this region gave 1 day off to domestic workers. Otherwise, by law, even a day off was not there in national legislation. The second area, I think, is about enhancing wage protection and improving wages. And just let me say a little bit about wage protection. There are some wage protection mechanisms that can be put in place, such as electronic transfers, wage slips, etc. But we should give consideration to wage guarantee mechanisms to cover wages in times of crisis. And in fact, these wage guarantee mechanisms exist in a number of countries, including in Singapore. 3 is about improving housing. I think we have to put attention to employer-provided housing. And already Malaysia has passed new regulations. Singapore has put in place a new scheme to build improved housing. I think this is an area where some guidance will be helpful guidance developed through stakeholder consultation. 4th is extending migrant workers' social protection. We have seen during the pandemic that migrants did not have access to income support or unemployment insurance, except in some exceptions, and equal protection here is very important. So as my time is up, Francesco, let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Nadim, and apologies for cutting you short, but I want to also give the opportunity for others and questions at the end. Without further ado, I'll give the mic to Niari, and I'll ask her, following up on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants and their families, what does the report says about as a way of building back better or building back forward, and looking ahead on how can the UN network on migration support member states on the ground to advance the main messages of the report in support to GCM implementation. Over to you, Niari. Thanks.
Thank you. So in addition to what I said in my earlier remarks, I wanted to highlight that the report outlines a number of measures that speak to comprehensive whole of society, whole of government approaches in a COVID-impacted world, where safe and orderly migration is vital in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. In particular, the report highlights that the Global Compact, as my fellow colleague speakers have also just been emphasizing in the course of their remarks, remains a critical tool for Asia and the Pacific, indeed the world over, in the arsenal that we need to deploy in effectively overcoming the pandemic, and including in the development and implementation of post-COVID recovery policies and plans to build forward stronger and better. Speaking squarely, I think also to specific groups that are impacted in unique ways remains critical. And here I'll point to the feminization of poverty, escalation of violence against women, the compounded exclusion and hardship experienced by women in certain quarters, children, the youth, and the need for a careful mainstreaming of our responses and greater in investment in social protections that speak to all sectors of society. And recalling here that one of the very first statements issued by the network at the global level asserted that COVID-19 does not discriminate, and neither should our response. This fundamental reflection has not changed and is embodied in the 360-degree approach to the GCM and cross-cutting independent guiding principles and the 23 objectives that inform it. And we in the network, as we look to develop our work plan for 2021, are committed to advancing this messaging at all levels, be it global, regional, or national. We are keen to explore how we might connect with other mechanisms, actors, and initiatives at the regional level on the ground in order to broaden, deepen, and echo these messages. This is something we will hopefully take forward in consultation with my colleagues in the network. And to this end, we welcome your views, comments, and reflections, and thank you.
Many thanks, Nyari, and for your reflections. And we have the last, but definitely not least, Sabine, to have the last conclusions on what has been the role of the UN network, the UN system, sorry, as a whole in producing this report, and looking forward to the regional review in March 2021. How and with what messages does the report contribute to this process? Thanks a lot for your brevity, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Francisco. The report draws on the varied experiences of the members of the regional network, and it weaves it into a unified and comprehensive baseline assessment, a reality check, if you will. This offers a basis, we hope, for the member states to work closely with stakeholders to advance the implementation of the Global Compact on the ground. 2021 marks the first time in Asia Pacific that countries will review the implementation of the Global Compact, and we hope the report will inform this review. Some of the challenges, and we have heard about this, of international migration have been exacerbated by COVID-19. This should make the call to action on the 23 objectives louder, clearer, and more urgent. We propose 3 messages which complement or reiterate the ones we already heard. First, since the Global Compact is firmly rooted in the 2030 Agenda, and since all countries in the region are struggling to achieve the goals and targets, there must be further commitment to and work on achieving the SDGs that support the GCM implementation and vice versa. Second, migration is inherently international. No country can address it alone. Since most migration in the region is regional in nature, regional, sub-regional, and cross-regional cooperation should be strengthened. International migration should be governed by the rule of law, not by exception. And it should be implemented equally without discrimination and aligned with the principles of due process. Migrants in vulnerable situations, such as women migrants or children affected by migration, are in special need of respect and protection, and the independence, agency, and leadership of migrant women and girls should be recognized. Third, and lastly, advancing implementation of the GCM on the ground can only benefit everyone if a whole of society and whole of government approach is used. A multi-sectoral approach, meaningfully engaging all government entities and other stakeholders is needed. Working together helps everyone achieve more, faster. The GCM is a framework. It's a roadmap. It's an action plan, which we need to take forward together now. Let's move in this direction together as we review the GCM in the region for the first time in a few months. In doing so, let us remember the many migrants we're talking about, the migrants, their families in the region. We, the regional network and ESCAP, are looking forward to engaging with you again in March. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for your concluding words, and also for reminding us that this gigantic task requires joint and working all together to address this. There is a little bit of time for questions, But I will, in the chat, there is one question. If I can read it, what is the difference between a law and global compact? I don't know if perhaps Sabine or Pia would go for it.
Just quickly to say that the Global Compact legally differs from a treaty or the conventions, for instance, that Nilam had mentioned. It's not a binding instrument under the United Nations. Member states have not had to ratify it as they would normally ratify, for instance, the Migrant Workers Convention or the ILO instruments. However, it represents a commitment because of the endorsement, its endorsement by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So member states have, those that have voted for the resolution have committed really to see this, as has been mentioned, as a pathway, as a roadmap to take forward. So it's a sign, of collective commitment, I would say, of the international community to take this forward in the spirit of international cooperation and solidarity.
Many thanks, Pia, and many thanks all the panelists and all of you for celebrating it together with us today, this lunch, and perhaps Nanette wants to say the concluding words.
I will go to the next.
Yes, okay. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Francisco, and also thank you to the panel, this panel that you moderated. I think we had very rich highlights and perspectives from the Asia Pacific Migration Report. Now, let me begin. We're now going to the second panel, where I'm welcoming all, in particular the discussants for this panel, and the session which is entitled "On the Road to the Regional Review of the Global Compact for Migration in Asia and the Pacific," which is now scheduled in March. The exchanges that we will have will offer us an opportunity to reflect on the implementation of the GCM, as we commonly call it, and to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on the lives of migrants and members of their families from a whole of government and a whole of society perspective. This next panel, we will have 55 minutes for this session, and in it, we will hear from distinguished colleagues and excellencies. We have Mr. Enrico Foss, the Assistant Secretary of the Office of the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers, the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, joining us online. Also joining us online is Ibu Penny Herasati, the Director of the Sociocultural and International Organization of Developing Countries, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia. Joining us online is Mr. Udaya Rai from the Migrants Trade Union, Republic of Korea. And last but not the least, Ms. Eni Lestari, the International Migrants Alliance, speaking from the migrants, the voice from the migrants. We will also hopefully have a brief Q&A session and would ask that the participants reserve their questions and comments or interventions until the end of the Q&A. So really, we're without much further ado, I'd like to actually turn on our discussants today are given at least a maximum of 6 minutes to allow for a Q&A that will follow. But I'd like to turn on the floor now to Assistant Secretary Enrico Foss from the Philippines. And if I may, I believe you are online already. He's online already. So if I may invite you to briefly share with us the experience of developing your response to the regional review survey and share your reflections on the challenges and opportunities in implementing the GCM and engaging in the regional review process. So, Mr. Enrico Foss, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nanette, for this opportunity and for everyone for giving us the opportunity. Excellencies, partners in the United Nations, partners in the private sectors and civil society. A pleasant day for everyone. Thank you for giving the Philippines the opportunity to share our experiences in the implementation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. I am honored to have been given this chance to speak, especially today, is in the celebration of International Migrants Day. Happy International Migrants Day to everyone. The Global Compact for Migration, or GCM, is a key reference for migration policies in the Philippines. We fought hard for the adoption of the GCM. For over 2 years of consultation and negotiations, we argued that the objectives of the GCMs are practical and doable, that these are not simply aspirations, these are results of the lessons learned from the actual practice and experience. Given that we have more than 10 million overseas Filipinos all over the world, and their remittances accounts for 9.3% of our GDP and 7.8% of our GNP, the least that we could do for our migrants is to put premium in protecting their rights and promoting their welfare. In short, asserting that migrants should be treated decently as GCM encourages all countries to do so. Colleagues, for over 4 decades, the Philippines has created a network of government institutions, all mandated to address our migrants' needs and concerns. We have our office, the Office of Migrant Workers Affairs, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, and the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration in the Ministry of Labor, among others. We also have an active involvement of the civil society, collaborating with the government in the promotion of migrant rights. This demonstrated commitment for migrant rights protection and promotion of their welfare facilitated in the invitation to the Philippines to be one of the GCM champion countries. The Philippines is pleased to report that it submitted uh, its responses to the survey conducted by the UN ESCAT and the UN Network for Migration in the preparation for the voluntary GCM review. Accomplishing the survey was also helpful to us. It provided us a platform to gauge where we are now in terms of our migration governance policies and practices, good and bad. We are also pleased to report that the responses to the survey was a product of a whole of government and a whole of society approach through an inclusive process involving government agencies and multiple stakeholders responsible for the country's migration governance. Another significant milestone for the Philippines is an addition of a new chapter on international migration and the development in the Philippine Development Plan 2017-2022, which is the country's medium-term national development plan. This chapter of our national development plan is mainly based on the GCM. This new chapter would, in effect, be our national implementation plan of the GCM. Colleagues, the Philippine government commitment to the GCM continues to remain strong. 2 days ago, our Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro L. Locsin Jr. participated in the virtual launch of BRIDGE. BRIDGE is a joint program of the UN country team in the Philippines and the Philippine government, which aims to bridge recruitment and return and reintegration. The BRIDGE program was one of the recipients of the Multi-Purpose Trust Fund of the UN Migration Network after it was selected from among 76 proposals from 56 countries. Most importantly, the BRIDGE program is aimed at to implement the GCM Objective 6 on ethical recruitment and Objective 21 on a return and reintegration. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought challenges to our Filipino migrants. Many were displaced and stranded from different parts of the world. Some were infected with COVID-19. Many have lost their jobs and were forced to return back home. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic is harshest to those groups that were already vulnerable situation even before the crisis due to their ethnicity, gender, and migration status. Cognizance of the migrants' vulnerabilities, we join hand with other UN member states in a joint statement on the impact of pandemic on the migrants, and including this in the concerns of the UN General Assembly Omnibus Resolution on COVID-19. No less than our President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, encouraged the UN member states during the 75th UN General Assembly to adhere to the GCM in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Philippines has consistently called for the international community to leave no one behind once the COVID-19 vaccine has been developed. Migrants, no matter their status, should have the right to access the vaccine in host countries. Addressing the pandemic calls for inclusivity and herd immunity from the vaccines is a better view for COVID-19 to end. As the UN Secretary General puts it, no one among us is safe until everyone is safe. The return of our migrants has also tremendous impact in our economy. As I said, remittances accounted for 9.3% of our GDP. But due to the precarious situation of our overseas Filipino workers that are they based abroad, our government has decided to conduct large-scale mass repatriation, no matter the cost, to get our people safely back to the Philippines. Since the start of the pandemic, our department, the Department of Foreign Affairs alone, has facilitated the repatriation of more than 300,000 Filipino workers abroad. We expect to repatriate 80,000 more by the end of the year. Our embassies and consulates abroad were also granted standard funds to provide immediate assistance to distressed overseas Filipinos for emergency supplies, medical expenses, shipment of remains, among others. Our work did not stop with the repatriation of our nationals. We put in place COVID-19 testing centers, quarantine facilities for the repatriates. We also assist in their travels back to their hometowns. We do our part in making sure that they are provided adequate assistance for their reintegration back to the Philippines. The pandemic response initiative that would not have been possible without the coordination of the various Philippine government agencies and civil society. We also thank the international organization and countries of destination in helping us reach out to our migrants. Colleagues, the Asia-Pacific Regional Review of the GCM is just a few months away. We express our full support for this regional review. Rest assured that the Philippines' active involvement in the review process. Be assured also that the Philippines' continuing commitment to the implementation of the GCM. Colleagues, the GCM gave us a platform for the decent treatment of migrants. Let us continue our cooperation and strong partnership. Let us continue to master the political will to implement the GCM, all for the protection of the rights and the promotion of the welfare of all migrants all over the world. Thank you and happy Independence, happy International Migrants Day to everyone. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much, Mr. Enrico Foss. We appreciate and recognize the efforts of the Philippine government in ensuring a whole of government and whole of society approach in looking at in treating the migrants decently and addressing their needs and welfare of the Filipino migrants, especially with the COVID-19 challenges. We also thank you and appreciate the Philippines for having submitted the survey, the responses to the survey that was shared earlier, and that congratulations also to the Philippines for having been a beneficiary or have received funding from the bridge from the UN Migration Trust Fund. Thank you very much. On that note, our next, I would like to turn to Ibu Penny from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia, where I'd like to ask a question on what does being a GCM champion country mean to you, and why does the Global Compact of Migration matter? Why should it matter, not just to Indonesia, but to all countries in Asia and the Pacific? Ibu Penny, you have the floor. Just while we're waiting, we're very also pleased to announce to share with you that of the 15 champion countries in the world, 5 of the champion countries of the GCM are from our region. We're very proud of that. The Philippines, 1, Indonesia, 1. Yeah. Sorry, just checking. Is Indonesia online? Yes. Okay. Ibu Penny?
Yes.
Okay. Ibu
Yes.
Penny, can you please unmute?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Sincere apology that I didn't turn on the microphone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear, Ibu.
Thank you. Thank you once again, moderator, Ibu Nenet Motus, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again for the opportunity to share our view on this important event. Let me first of all congratulate everyone for the International Migrants Day. As the country of origin, Indonesia is home to over 3 million overseas Indonesians, mostly comprised of overseas Indonesian workers. In this regard, we believe that migration and human mobility have always existed with the same underlying motivation, to search for the better life. We are therefore fully committed to ensure that all Indonesian migrants are safe and protected in all stages of migration, in line with our national priority agenda, as well as the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. Prior to the adoption of the GCM in 2018, Indonesia has enacted the law number 18, year 2017, on the protection of Indonesian migrant workers as an improvement of similar law adopted in 2004. In addition to this law, we have been implementing various policies, programs, and projects aimed at not only providing services for Indonesian migrants, but also actualizing their contribution to sustainable development at home and abroad. Following the adoption of the GCM, Indonesia has been making constant efforts to achieve GCM objectives at national level. We have been strengthening coordination among relevant stakeholders, namely government institutions, civil society organizations, academic institutions, as well as migrant workers' unions, by organizing outreach programs at the central and local level. In light of this, we have seen a significant improvement of GCM awareness as a guidance to improve the migration governance in holistic and comprehensive manner. At present, we are in the process of developing a national action plan to achieve the GCM objectives in detailed and measurable manner. In the national action plan, we put emphasis on Objective 1, among other priority objectives, as a continuation to the Indonesian One Data policy launched last year. Data production on international migration often becomes a challenge due to the differences in conceptual and methodological issues among relevant stakeholders. In this regard, we have implemented a more comprehensive approach for the data integration, which is planned to be completed in 2021. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at this year's International Migrant Day commemoration, we are in the midst of unexpected challenges for all humanity due to the COVID-19 pandemic, with more complex challenges faced by migrants. Migrants have been at the forefront of the fight against COVID-19 through their work in field of health, transportation, and other essential sectors. Migrants are also disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 through job losses, discrimination, and xenophobia. Moreover, millions of migrants were stranded during the early months of this year due to the mobility restriction. We believe that countries have made their best efforts to overcome the impacts of COVID-19 on migration and have a lot of experience as well as lessons learned regarding the implementation of GCM during the COVID-19 pandemic to be shared. Therefore, we welcome the Asia-Pacific Regional Review of the implementation of GCM organized by UNESCOP and the Regional UN Network on Migration for Asia and the Pacific to be held on 10 to 12 March 2021 as a platform to discuss challenges, opportunities, as well as potential areas for regional cooperation on international migration. To conclude, we would like to reaffirm Indonesia's commitment to continue implementing the GCM, and we look forward for a productive meeting during the regional review next year. Thank you, Ibu Nenet. Back to you.
Terima kasih, Ibu Penny. Thank you very much for highlighting to us what Indonesia has been doing in terms of the GCM implementation moving forward, and that we're pleased to hear of your engaging with the National Action Plan, particularly emphasizing the importance of data and having evidence to inform migration inclusive policies. Thank you, Ibu. Now, I'd like to turn to Mr. Udaya Rai, who is also who's coming from the the Migrants Trade Union from the Republic of Korea. I have two questions for you, if I may, but let me start with one, the first one. From the perspective of trade unions, what are the main challenges in providing greater access to safe, regular, and accessible migration pathways, keeping in mind the complex and interlinked migration drivers in the region? Over to you, Mr. Adayarai.
Thank you very much. In the case of Korea, the main challenge in the ensuring safe migration and decent work lies in the employment permit system, which restrict the number of times migrant workers can change workplace. Under the system, migrant workers are forced to ensure slavery like working condition and deadly long working hours, heavily workload and low wage, verbal and physical abuse at work, and even the danger of work-related injury, disease, and death. This is why the ILO and the UNCR recommended the Korean government to amend the EPS to remove such a restriction. Regularly, MTU, KCTU, and NGOs join in filing constitutional petition against EPS. The working visit visa holders who are mainly Korean with foreign nationality are facing almost same challenge except restriction on charge of workplace. Especially migrant workers suffer a fatal industrial accident in twice frequently than local workers in construction and manufacture sector. In addition to that, so for the EPS workers in agriculture, livestock and fishing industry, provisions on rest time and holidays is in Labor Standard Law Act are exempt. No break time are allowed and they can take only 1 day for leave per month. No overtime benefit is paid. Housing environment is very poor and non-residential. The facilities such as funeral greenhouse or container are provided at migrants their own cost, which amount hundreds of US dollar according to the Ministry of Labor Directive. Workers is fishery sector who are working in the large ship of 20 tons or more, who are not covered by the Labor Standard Act, but the Superiors Act are required by private agencies under which they should pay more than 10,000 US dollar for recruitment fee. Management agencies collects commission every month from migrant workers, and in many cases, ship owner confiscate the passport or bank book. Minimum wage are not applicable for superiors, and the minimum wage for migrant workers in fishing industry is much lower than other workers. Recently, in the Parliament inspection on the government affairs, migrant workers in fishing industry who are working in the island testified that he has worked 360 hours a month, paid much lower than statutory minimum wage, and forced to work in other workplace, which is illegal. The workers were almost detained in the island because he cannot access to the ticket for passenger ship to go out the island. In this island, 150 migrants from Indonesia, East Timor, and Vietnam with 500 local residents. It is hard to say there has been any achievement in the recent 2 years as the government, but little effort to improve the working and living condition of migrant workers. One thing changed is the government introduced a regulation to a housing environment, but there is no single case in which the migrant workers could successfully change their workplace due to the poor housing condition below the standards. Decent work, the goal 6 of Global Compact is far from the current legislation, institution, and the practice on migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you for that for your response to that first question. May I have can I have a follow-up question with you, please? What is the contribution of migrants to building back better? And what have we learned from the COVID-19 response and the country's recovery efforts that can help us in advancing the implementation of the Global Compact?
At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, migrant workers were not able to secure from marks or receive the proper relief aid from the government. During the pandemic, all members of the Korean society, regardless that their citizen or nationality, are expected to implement the obligation to prevent spread of infection. In the same way, the face the some social and financial difficulties. So it is natural and government to include the migrant in supporting. However, when anti-droplet masks were rare and publicly controlled based on the health insurance computer network system, migrants who are not enrolled to the insurance cannot access to the masks providing relief aid by the central or local government was also discriminatory, and the only permanent resident and the married migrants were included. This was strongly criticized by the trade union and the civil society, especially migrant community. At the same time, this situation created various space to debate how the Korean society could be changed in the term of legal and institutional discrimination, which expand the coverage of social welfare related act such as the Emergency Aid, Support Act, and the National Living Security Act, which only cover marriage, migrants, and refugees. This kind of migrants exclusive act should be revised. Secondly, the maximum period of the stay under the EPS employment permit system should be extended, which is limited to the period with application for permanent resident is not possible. At least during the pandemic, EPS workers whose working period was limited should be permitted to extend their stay. Thirdly, migrants workers should be equally protected by the government laws and the social protection system, especially all the social insurance should cover migrant workers in the mandatory basis. Fourthly, comprehensive anti-discrimination act should be enacted, and based on this, the whole society should be able to identify what discrimination is, make effort to reduce racism. Last but not at least, undocumented migrants should be legalized to guarantee their human and labor right, as well as to prevent measures against the COVID-19. Due to all this, support and solidarity between migrant workers, community, and civil and labor organizations should be strengthened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've heard from two Asia champion countries. We've also heard from a migrant trade union representative. And now it is my pleasure to also invite Ms. Annie Lestari, who's going to be our migrants, to hear from a migrant's voice. And Ms. Annie, as a migrant, have you seen any change over recent years in how migrants move across borders and how they experience living and working in destination countries? Over to you for the first question, Ms. Annie.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and happy International Migrants Day to all of us. Let me begin with my personal story. I left my country in Indonesia in 2000 to be a migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong. First, I have never wanted to be a migrant, but Asian financial crisis gave me and million others with no choice but to migrate in order to survive. Second, even in my time, I myself and many others have endured human rights violation from underpayment, denial of rest day and food, to confiscation of travel document. That is the very reason why I decided to learn my rights, organize, and dedicate myself to advocate for migrants' rights. I really wish no one else will become migrant worker, but if they have to, they should not experience exploitation as I were before. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Throughout my years of migratory journey and even listening to the different testimonies of migrants coming from various countries and sectors who participated in yesterday global online rally organized by International Migrants Alliance, I witnessed the treatment against migrants has been worsening. Here are my observations in terms of changes and challenges. Number one, the number of migrants within Asia Pacific and beyond continue to grow. The number is so huge, reaching to 260 million worldwide, which led to the endless crisis of migration. And it's really worrying. So I wonder the effectiveness of the government, international and regional institutions in addressing the drivers of migration, such as poverty, environmental destruction, and even political conflicts. Number two, crossing the border has increasingly become very difficult and very exploitative. Migrants are arranged to migrate through legalized channels set by the government in partnership with privates, which claim to be more safe and protected. However, in our experiences, the regular channel is more exploitatively organized and full of human rights violations too. Sadly, those violations are not even investigated, and their perpetrators have never been prosecuted. This kind of discriminatory treatment really anger migrants and force many to choose the irregular channels. What is more sad, COVID-19 pandemic has been used to tighten border control without even an understanding to the desperation of migrants to survive. I'm afraid it will lead to another crisis of migration and gross human rights violation. Number three, even without pandemic, migrants have faced a great structural challenges such as exclusion in labor protection, no working hours, live-in mandatory, no right to union, temporary visa arrangement, arrest and deportation, imprisonment, accidents and death, and so forth. Those problems remain unresolved. The pandemic has worsened those pre-existing problems and now create new problems for migrants, such as longer working hours, denial of rest and rest day, denial of mask, sanitizer, even proper food, harassment and intimidation in places where migrants gather, termination and deportation with no financial assistance by home and host government, stigmatization as coronavirus carrier, exclusion from any relief and subsidy, and so forth. So in conclusion, migrants do not only fight COVID-19, but also fight against social exclusion, discrimination, and criminalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Annie. Thank you for your very eloquent and very profound perspectives, sharing that with us. Um, may I have a follow-up question, if I may? Looking at the meeting in March and beyond, what can governments, stakeholders, and the UN system do together to advance the implementation of the global compacts from your perspective? Over to you, Ibu and Annie.
Terima kasih. The first step that the governments, stakeholder, and the UN system must do together is really to recognize the main stakeholder in migration, which is the grassroots migrants themselves, as a vital actor in the GCM process and realize this potential by bringing us in, discussing it with us, and working with us to realize the objective of the GCM. When I spoke at the United Nations Summit on Migrants and Refugees in 2016, I mentioned in my speech nothing about migrants without migrants. This is to reaffirm migrants' position that we are the main people who will be affected by any policies and regulation on migration. And thus, we have all the right to be part of any discussion of migration and be part even in the monitoring and evaluation. Migrants can be an active partner rather than an object of policies and mere beneficiary of charity. However, for years after and with the COVID-19 pandemic still raging, we see migrants being left in the dark, abandoned, made to be at the receiving end, and made to wait. Although I can say proudly that many migrants, regardless of our employment and immigration status, choose not to wait. We self-organize, we send submission, we campaign, we even protest. Despite this, many governments refuse to let us in the dialogues, still enforce policies and practices that put migrants at risk and resort to scapegoating in the midst of the crisis. Oftentimes, we find ourselves protecting and defending one another from government action. There is no other solution except to recognize and treat migrants as an actor, not criminal, not slave, and even commodities. Recognition is a basic human right, but without this, any kind of policies will just be a counterproductive and harming to migrants themselves.
Thank you, Ibu Annie. Again, very profound reflections, and we hear you. From the migrant's voice, nothing for us without us is certainly something we are reminded of again. And thank you again for those reflections. I'm just trying to see whether we have any some questions now for the question and answer session. Are there any questions that are coming from the chat box? Just checking. Is there any? No. Let me just then conclude by saying, allowing me to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to participate in this session. And I also like to extend my appreciation to the People's Republic of Bangladesh for co-hosting this event and for extending my gratitude to the organizers of the event from ESCAP, from ILO, from OHCHR, from UNDP and UNICEF, who made this event possible. I'd like to also acknowledge the colleagues in the network with special thanks to the main authors of the report that we have launched here today, ESCAP, ILO, and OHCHR. I also wish to acknowledge the contributions of UNDP, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNODC, OCHA, UNAIDS, UNDRR, UNFPA, and UN Women to the report, as well as to thank them for their partnership, the cooperation, and the support in the network. I'd like to also extend our profound appreciation and collectively thank on the behalf of the network and the UN family that for the GCM countries who have volunteered or have volunteered that they have to be a champion country. That will be the People's Republic of Bangladesh, represented by Mishanas here, the Republic of Indonesia, the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal, the Republic of the Philippines, and the Kingdom of Thailand, represented here today. And to all member states in attendance, as well as to stakeholders we have on the panels in the room, and those colleagues online, for your continued commitment to the GCM, to the migrants and societies, and the global village that it serves. So we look forward to working with you in the lead up to the March 2021 regional review meeting. And our work continues to make sure that the regional review is a success and productive and is meaningful to all of us. Thank you very much.
Kind thanks to all of those involved in the two panels. And with this, we come to the end of the panels and our closing segment of the event. We would like to invite Ms. Marati Nalita Adamo, the Director of the Social Division Department of International Organizations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Thailand, to deliver some closing remarks. Ms. Adamo, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And let me start by commending the IOM and all of the related agencies, as well as the government of Bangladesh, as well as all of the participants here today in person and through video link for their very active engagement and some very passionate interventions. Also for sharing their experiences, their perspectives and insights on the important work we have all committed to. Allow me also to join others in appreciating the efforts of the authors and the team involved in the preparation of the Asia Pacific Migration Report 2020. In addition to celebrating International Migrants Day, we have had, I believe, a very useful opportunity today, although it was a short one, to hear about the findings of the report, to also hear from the UN agencies some very useful comments and proposals and insights that we can take forward, and also to hear the experiences of some member states regarding their path to achieving the goals of the GCM. And this is important for us because we need to be in a position to amplify and replicate our successes, as well as share views on how to address the gaps and the challenges, either domestically or internationally through targeted collaboration. In Thailand's view, the GCM is a golden opportunity to learn from one another. And we look forward to continuing our active engagement with the process, in particular to ensuring that the upcoming regional review is a successful one. We want it to be one that contributes globally the wealth of work, knowledge, insight, and best practices that we have right here in the region. Thailand's implementation of our commitments to the GCM began right after its adoption with the establishment of the National Working Group on GCM and GCR implementation. Using a whole of government approach, the working group is the formal mechanism on important developments and obstacles to implementation. This is where we coordinate with all of the line agencies. And in our latest meeting that we had just in August, the working group endorsed Thailand to join GCM implementation efforts as champion country. This role is quite significant for us. We view it not as a role for countries that believe they have succeeded in managing migration. As a matter of fact, it is actually a role for countries that recognize the critical importance of doing more. Being a champion country means to us that we will redouble our efforts on further addressing the challenges, in particular in areas that hold important for us. And for Thailand, this is about health and it's about children. So first and foremost, ensuring the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health has been a consistent policy of successive governments in Thailand. And today, unfortunately, COVID-19 has made the international community painfully aware of the need to support this right and to do more. Thailand is committing through our role as champion country to work towards ensuring access to healthcare and services for migrant communities in Thailand, which coincides with Objective 15. We are working to ensure in specific terms that our universal health coverage scheme is appropriately accessible to different types of migrants and their needs. Secondly, with regard to children, Thailand has committed to utilizing alternatives to detention, A2D, for migrant children, coinciding with Objective 13. And this work began in earnest when 7 line agencies signed an MOU to this effect. It will continue as we work to address the challenges to realizing zero detention of migrant children by ensuring that resources, personnel, and standard operating procedures are in place and that they adapt to evolving circumstances. It is our hope that sharing our experiences, our challenges, our positive practices will lead to enhancing implementation of the GCM at the global level, as well as cooperation towards global migration governance. And in this spirit of cooperation, Thailand is pleased to say that we have earmarked a contribution of $25,000 to the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund. Colleagues, when we adopted the GCM 2 years ago, no one foresaw that before our first regional review, we would be dealing with a pandemic so unprecedented in scale and scope, negatively and directly impacting our work on migration. Nevertheless, we aim to embrace the challenges with a positive attitude and see it as an opportunity to identify and address the gaps. To conclude, we look forward to working together with all relevant partners, all countries, all representatives of civil society in the preparation of substantive inputs to the regional review in March 2021. So with that, let me wish everyone a happy International Migrants Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sandamo, for inspiring words. And we move on to invite Mr. Kamal Uddin Ahmed, full-time member, National Human Rights Commission, Bangladesh, to deliver his closing remarks. Mr. Ahmed, please.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Can you hear me, please?
We hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to this part of the program marking International Migrants Day. We all have witnessed the launching of the significant document, the Asia-Pacific Migration Report 2020, with all important information and discussions. Subsequent discussions were very interesting, and I personally learned a lot, and I must thank everyone for making a very good contribution into this discussion. Congratulations to all those who worked hard for preparing this report. This is a baseline assessment of the implementation of the Global Compact for Migration in Asia and the Pacific. The discussions and discourses on migrants' atrocities have been high on the global media agenda. Apart from the phenomena of regular migrations, where impoverishment and various forms of violation of human rights take place, families were desperately fleeing conflict from some countries and in some other cases. Each day, more people risk their lives on boats, sometimes as traumatized victims, and reached a new country with few belongings and no form of shelter, started their lives from scratches. At such a situation, the Global Compact is the first intergovernmentally negotiated agreement prepared under the auspices of the United Nations, covering all dimensions of international migration in a holistic and comprehensive manner. Adopted in New York on adopted in New York and Declaration of Refugee and Migrants on 19 September 2016, as I remember, the 193 UN member states recognized the need for a comprehensive approach to human mobility and enhanced cooperation at the global level towards the development of Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. It sent a powerful message that migration, asylum seeking, conflict, and disaster-induced displacement, missing migrants, human trafficking, refugee matters, and remittances had become major issues in the international agenda. Asia-Pacific Migration Report will inform the Asia-Pacific regional review of GCM implementation to be held from 10 to 12 March 2021. As a preparation for that, so far 3 out of 4 targeted consultations have held, and they generated important opinions of stakeholders, and those have been carefully gathered by ESCAP and UN Regional Network on Migration. I had the chance to attend 3 consultations and seen how nicely things were discussed over there. Migration is an inherent impulse in human nature. People move or are forced to move from place to place for survival or to look for a land of opportunity. As a result, people end up into various racial, cultural, linguistic, and ethnic groups. Gene and cultural transmission and accommodation are also based upon migration. These are our pre-ontological understandings. World Migration Report 2020 reveals the increase of international migration in line with recent trends. The number of international migrants is estimated to be almost 272 million globally, 3.5% of the world's population, with nearly two-thirds being labor migrants. In today's launching, we have heard that 65 million people from this region have immigrated, and 101 million people are outside this region now living abroad, which is definitely a very big number. and a big part of the total migration account. Countries and destinations where they eventually get settled become productive members of the workforce, pay rent and taxes, and ultimately make contributions to the poverty alleviation and development of that society. But quite often they observe such attitudes among locals that they are suspicious, threats, or burdens. So the reciprocated gesture and consequent narratives about them are shocking, unfriendly to, sometimes inhuman, and even to the extent of violation of their basic human rights. At such treatment, it is needed to remember that regardless of their status in a country, both documented or undocumented, regular and irregular, all migrants, migrant workers, and members of their families have the basic human rights, such as right to life, liberty, security of person, right to freedom from slavery and servitude or torture, or to quell inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the right to equal protection of law, and freedom from discrimination, freedom from arbitrary arrest, detention, freedom from exploitation and forced labor, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to education for children. In today's question and answer session, Pia have very nicely elaborated all these things from the report point of view. The challenges and difficulties underlying inter-country, inter-regional migration demands enhanced attention. Cooperation and collective action among countries and regions is therefore of utmost necessity. That has rightly been manifested in the formation of GCM. At the COVID-19 situation, now migrants bear the brunt of this crisis disproportionately compared to the locals. Many migrants, although have valid visa and work permit, were sent back arbitrarily, lost their due payments, and are facing discrimination of COVID healthcare. In Bangladesh situation, I can see from about 34 countries, 195,698 migrant workers had to return, mostly for not having work. These returnees have been facing discriminations in the society at home also, unfortunately. Held responsible for spreading coronavirus, facing ill treatment, boycott, attack, rent-seeking, and harassment as severe violations of human rights. But fortunately, many humanitarian actions from the government of Bangladesh, from instant cash financial supports to loans right at the arrival airports, G2G negotiations with destination country authorities, and to job supports are being provided and considered effectively. I'd like to wrap up with few words like, we must look at all forms of migration situations from ideological foundations of basic human rights. Policymakers must, in conversations, impose enriched and changed narrative about migrants. All action about migrants must be gender representative and have rights-based. Human mobility should never be prohibited and restricted, and discrimination shouldn't be there. Conducive environment through acceptance of multiculturalism, diversity must be created for migrants to add value to the sustainable development goal. Migrants must be given due honor and recognition for their host country. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all and all colleagues and experts who worked hard to make this program a success. I would like to thank Bangladesh Embassy in Thailand, especially the Charge d'Affaires and officials for providing immense cooperation to organize such an important meeting. I believe those of you who are attending this celebration physically are maintaining sufficient health rules so as to keep yourself and all your family members safe from COVID infection. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me a chance to make this closing remark before this August gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mr. Ahmed, for very helpful and encouraging comments. We have now come to the end of our observance of International Migrants Day 2020, as well as the launch of the Asia-Pacific Migration Report 2020. This is available online. There is also a QR code as well as the online link in the YouTube channel. On behalf of the co-organizers, ESCAP, the Regional UN Network on Migration, and the government of Bangladesh, I would like to thank all of those who have spoken and participated today, whether online, in person, or whether representing governments, stakeholders, or migrants themselves. As we enter the critical year ahead, we will be able to carry out the first regional review of the Global Compact for Migration and take stock of progress, challenges, lessons learned, and ways forward. We hope that we can maintain the positive energy, which was cited by our colleague from Thailand, and ensure that migration contributes to sustainable development, decent work, and human rights for all. Before we adjourn the session, we would like to thank our colleagues from the ESCAP Conference Unit, who have been very active preparing for this and servicing the meeting. In addition, we like to recognize all of those from the Secretariat who behind the scenes have worked to make this session a memorable one. Now, we invite all participants currently present in the room to enjoy refreshments outside, generously provided by the government of Bangladesh. For those online, we share goodwill. Before we leave, may we please exit in a very orderly manner with proper physical distancing and ensuring that your valuables and personal belongings are with you. To conclude, thank you again to all participants, and we look forward to meeting you again. The meeting is adjourned. Good day.
Thank you very much.